Sunrise over Sutton Hoo, one of the most important Anglo-Saxon burial grounds in England. Beneath these mounds lie the graves of warrior kings from 7th century England, buried with their weapons and vast riches to accompany them into the next world. Today, Hayley Bullock from the British Museum Conservation Department is bringing back to Sutton Hoo some recently excavated objects. These have been conserved at the museum and are now going on display in the new visitor centre.
These objects were buried in a grave with a person, and that person lived and breathed and walked in the 6th century. I am acutely aware that these objects have very personal adornments and really are associated with death and funerary practices. It does feel strange sometimes.
The return of these objects to their original home in Sutton Hoo marks the end of a long process of conservation. This film follows the work of the British Museum conservation team as they apply their skills to conserving these unique treasures. Sutton Hoo was first excavated in 1939 on the eve of the Second World War. Under the watchful eye of landowner Edith Pretty, archaeologists discovered one of the richest hoards of treasure ever found in British soil. Buried within the remains of a 90-foot ocean-going ship, they found objects of great beauty and incredible craftsmanship. Shoulder clasps inlaid with garnet, a gold belt buckle decorated with intricate patterns, and finely decorated weapons of war. The treasure was a remarkable discovery, but little is known about the people who buried it there. They left no inscriptions nor written records of who they were. It's assumed that this was the burial of a powerful king, but his body was never found. Archaeologists believe it dissolved away in Sutton Hoo's acid soil. But why did the people bury their kings here? Some answers may have been revealed in 2000, when the National Trust started building a visitor centre to the north of the main burial grounds. To the surprise of archaeologists, these excavations revealed an even earlier Anglo-Saxon cemetery. Could these graves provide clues to the people who created such a rich and powerful kingdom in the generations to follow?
Any mounds have gone, they've been flattened over the years, but any Anglo-Saxon burial so close to Sutton Hoo are obviously of major importance, and it gives some reason for why the main barrow cemetery is situated here, apparently in splendid isolation. But now we can see we have this folk cemetery of slightly earlier date, only 500 metres away, as if we're in a funerary landscape.
John and his team found 19 inhumations, better known as burials, and 17 graves containing cremated remains. 2 in particular caught their interest. One held what looked like the contorted remains of a warrior. His body, long since dissolved in the acid soil, was just recognizable by an outline left in the sand. Next to him lay his heavily corroded sword, parts of his shield, and a spear. Nearby, archaeologists were puzzled to find 2 cremation bowls. One was made of pottery, the other of bronze. The metal bowl was too fragile to be touched on site, so was removed along with the protective earth surrounding it to the British Museum's conservation studios. Here, it will be carefully excavated under controlled laboratory conditions, along with the other delicate and precious objects found at Sutton Hoo.
No, sorry, 1013.
Hayley Bullock and Sarah Watkins specialise in metal conservation. Their first task today is to check through the objects that have arrived from the new site.
The general aim of conservation, really, for archaeological conservation, is probably twofold. The first thing, and probably the most important thing, is the information retrieval, so that we can pass that information on to curators, find specialists who will study those objects. So that's probably our primary aim. But of course, it's hoped that a lot of these objects will go on display, so we can give information to the general public and to help the general public understand these objects, we really need to try and present them in a way that is easily understood.
Sarah Watkins heads the conservation team. She's going to be working on the metal bowl, but first she must study photographs and X-rays to establish what lies inside the earth block.
It's like a voyage of discovery, really, to see what's happening. This bowl is going to be a fantastic opportunity for me to actually work with an object almost from the moment it's excavated. It's obviously a very fragile object, and none of us quite know what's going to be inside the wrappings, and that's the exciting part, but also the bit that's a bit nerve-wracking.
Angela Evans is the British Museum's Anglo-Saxon specialist. She's devoted much of her working life to Sutton Hoo.
It means a tremendous amount to me because it has this sort of magical quality. It's partly the way it's placed, sort of looking down onto the river, and partly the sort of tranquility of the mounds themselves. It's somewhere that I never fail to sort of really get a sense of presence when you're here. There's something really special about it.
1,500 years ago, the Anglo-Saxons came to this remote hilltop to burn and bury their dead. What secrets did they leave behind? Will the British Museum's conservators uncover new information about this early English civilization as they work on the sword, the shield and the bowl? Two weeks have passed since the conservation began, and Angela is eager to discuss progress with Hayley and Sarah.
Well, I'm the curator who's actually responsible for seeing the material going through the museum, and I work very closely with conservation. We spend a lot of time discussing the sort of methods of conservation and how we should progress objects and how we can get the best out of them from both a curatorial and a conservation point of view. It remains that these might be... Well, there's so much that conservation can do. I mean, I don't have X-ray eyes, so when an object comes corroded, for example, like the shield boss, totally corroded, I can only guess at what might be there. It's conservation that essentially unveils things. And then because I sometimes have a sort of faint idea of what we might be seeing, we can actually talk about it and be prepared for whatever actually pops up. So it's very much a sort of exciting two-way exchange.
With the arrival of the sword from the warrior's grave, Hayley Bullock begins work on its conservation.
This was lifted from site by the archaeologists, and they lifted it in quite a lot of soil. And so one of the first things that we did was to X-ray that object. We wanted to see exactly what was in that soil block, identify it, try and look at the material, try and look at the sorts of condition that object was in. And we were looking for a whole host of other things, things like type of sword, shape of sword, whether it had upper guards, lower guards, pommels, and any other attachments.
One of the first things the X-rays reveal is a distinct herringbone pattern through the metal, a vital clue to the pattern welding techniques used by Anglo-Saxon craftsmen to make this sword. Pattern welding results in a stronger, more beautiful sword that is reliable in battle, but requires great skill to forge. To take such trouble over making their weapons shows how important they must have been to the Anglo-Saxons. But what about the cremation bowl from Sutton Hoo? Has the X-ray helped Sarah to plan its conservation?
The general fuzziness of the X-ray is telling me that there is something inside the bowl. It's not just soil, which is confirming what we thought, that there may well be a cremation inside.
But does the possibility of finding human remains inside the bowl cause Sarah to change her approach to its conservation?
I hope I can work with it with respect. One way of doing that, for example, is that at the end of the day, when I've finished working with the bowl, I always cover it over so that the bones and the contents are actually covered. And that seems one way of working with it respectfully.
Little is known about the everyday lives of the people buried here. It's something that has always intrigued Angela Evans.
It's very interesting what we know and what we don't know about this time, or what we think we know. We're missing colour. We're missing all the organics, so we're missing things like carvings, carvings on wood, carvings on bone. We're missing patterns in textiles, patterns on shields. We imagine these things to be rather austere, but they were probably a riot of colour, of motifs, writhing dragons and flying birds. We've got none of this.
Back at the British Museum, Sarah is making progress with the conservation of the bowl. She has painstakingly removed the earth inside, layer by layer, which has revealed an important discovery.
As the contents have been excavated, been removed in layers, we've also discovered things that we didn't know were in there. For example, this comb, which is sitting on top of the cremation.
Both Anglo-Saxon men and women were buried with combs, so Sarah must get the bones out of the bowl to discover more about the person inside. But this is not a straightforward task.
To just try to lift that object off now, it would fall apart, it would disintegrate. I'm going to put Japanese tissue over the comb and all over the bone as well, to support and hold the whole block together in one piece.
We don't know the exact sort of rituals surrounding any burials, and cremations are quite hard because you have to speculate. What we do know that in some cremations, certainly the body would be laid out on a pyre. And sometimes other objects are actually placed in the grave after the bones have been scraped up and put in whatever container they are in, be it ceramic or copper alloy. And then the container itself is buried with unburnt objects as well.
There are great gaps in our knowledge about the Anglo-Saxons who lived during the so-called Dark Ages. What we do know is that they arrived sometime in the 5th century, filling a power vacuum left behind by the Romans. They began as small groups of independent farmers, but quickly organized themselves into fierce nation-states.
It's a very ambitious time when power, people are very aware of power and the uses of power. And also because land is power, there's a lot of skirmishing, a lot of fighting. They will go out and they will fight to extend their territory. It certainly wasn't a peaceful society.
So, did the warrior from Sutton Hoo suffer a violent death? We may never be able to say for certain, but by looking closely at the remains of his shield, there may be evidence of its use in battle. Decorative studs from the warrior's shield are being very carefully cleaned to see what clues can be revealed.
It's a gorgeous surface. There are some wear marks on the surface of that object, which sort of indicates that this object has been used. Sometimes with very glamorous objects like these, an idea has been put forward that these objects were just simply made for burial, but actually I can see wear marks and I know that this object has been used in some way in the past.
These wear marks suggest that the warrior's shield could have been used in battle, a view supported by Angela when she sees the studs reunited with the shield boss.
In some ways it's quite extraordinary. They're not actually a set. You've got two with the silver, applied silver rims, and then you've got these rosette-like ones here, here, and here. So you've got a set of 3 of those and 2, which suggest that maybe the boss had been ripped off the shield or something like that.
Perhaps the warrior's sword can yield more clues. To find out, Hayley has to carefully clean away the dirt from the surface.
It's difficult to say at this stage until the object is completely uncovered exactly what sort of condition the blade will be in. But this will never look shiny and white, steel, svelte-like blade.
After many hours of painstaking work, she discovers that the sword has been buried in its scabbard. She asks Fleur Shearman, the museum's expert in archaeological conservation, to give an opinion about her discovery.
You can see everywhere, up and down both sides of the blade, that there are these wood remains in place. And then it seems like, if you can see here, Fleur, can you see these features here? Well, it looks
Hayley has discovered evidence of unusual decoration on the wooden scabbard. Running up and down its length are fine strands of cord, something only ever found on 3 other swords.
obviously was very fine, it was pattern welded.
Yes.
And
the scabbard is quite elaborate, isn't it? We've got the braids, who knows, they might have even been coloured. We've got this string lining effect with the cords going under the leather. Perhaps the hilt is quite a high status material. It would be nice if there was a bit more of it. Perhaps, it might have even been ivory rather than horn, who knows?
So the evidence suggests that the warrior was a man of high status, a man who was involved in fighting, perhaps a member of an emerging aristocratic family. But what about the person who was cremated and buried near him? The comb and bones have now been removed from the cremation bowl, and Sarah has asked cremation specialist Jackie McKinley and the museum's Celtic expert Sue Youngs to give an opinion.
But the most interesting thing I really ought to mention first is that you said there's quite a lot of it and you've got some really big pieces there. The really big pieces are not human, they're animal. I suspect, although I'm not an animal bone specialist, that it's going to be horse. But as I say, that's not as weird as it might sound, because that's a relatively common occurrence.
But have you got enough of the human bone to be able to tell us anything?
Well, fortunately, we have got some useful pieces. Here, for instance, we have a piece of mandible. This is the front part of the mandible. This is where your chin is, essentially, here. Right. You can see here these little ridges. These are where the 2 sockets are. Right. And we have actually got a tooth root still in position there. What I can see here is that we've got full eruption of the permanent dentition. So, in fact, we've even got this, as I say, this tooth root here. So I know that we've got somebody who is at very least in their teens or, beyond the age of about sort of 14, 15.
We have gender yet?
It's a bit difficult to say just at this moment, but I would say from the small size of most of these bones, and they are quite small, that it's a fairly small cervical vertebra. And this really does look like a female.
So, what does this evidence tell us about the person who was cremated?
Cremation used to be considered at one time to possibly the poor man's option. But if you think about the effort that has to go into cremating a body, you have to collect all the wood, and in this case you would need a lot of wood because you're burning a horse as well as a human being. So you're going to need a fairly sizable pyre. There's a lot of horse to get rid of, and you have to sustain that pyre for long enough for that to burn away. So it was obviously a fairly large pyre, lots of wood, lots of time in collecting it, putting the pyre together, getting the horse up there onto the top of the pyre, waiting for the cremation to go through the process, and then of course the burial itself in this wonderful bowl, which in itself is very rare, suggests that we have got a fairly wealthy burial taking place here of an important person of some status.
The conservation process has now established that the metal bowl held the remains of a high-status woman in her 20s or 30s who was buried with her sacrificial horse. 4 months on, conservation work continues on the metal bowl. One of the final tasks before freeing the bowl from its earth block is to remove a bracket, known as an escutcheon, from its side. This had become detached in the soil and must be examined and cleaned before being reattached later in the conservation process. With all the bones and surrounding earth removed, the bowl is ready to be lifted from its earth block. This is a crucial stage in the conservation process, as the bowl is extremely fragile and could easily break.
Now maybe, hopefully possible, to lift this off the soil block and into this sand tray. Okay.
Yeah, Oh, it's not moving at all. Great. Look at that. Oh, look! Look! What have we got here?
Oh.
What do you think that is? That looks like a little rim or something, ring around something.
If I lift this up, maybe you can look underneath. I don't know.
What's just stuff? There's something on the bottom. Yep, definitely.
But very
thin.
Which
Very
didn't show on
Isn't
the
that
X-ray.
amazing? Yeah. But
And
it
I
certainly
think
looks...
there's a bit of textile there.
Oh, that'd be brilliant if there's textile.
Just a
Because
little.
Freed from its earth block, the hanging bowl will now be dismantled and strengthened before being reassembled to go on display.
The thing about the hanging bowls is that they come in from the Celtic northwest, so they're actually decorated in a completely different artistic style to the Anglo-Saxon metalwork. At this period, we've got our early Anglo-Saxon metalwork is decorated with animal ornament. It's animal interlace. It's very, very elegant, but it's completely different in inspiration from the Celtic material, which actually has its roots in the pre-Roman Iron Age. We know that by the time they were buried at least, they've been used quite considerably. A lot of them have been repaired. And sometimes just escutcheons are buried. The actual ornamental escutcheons, they've been taken off the hanging bowl and they've been pierced as though they've been actually worn around the neck. So that they're obviously very, very highly valued. But of course, what we don't know is how they come into the Anglo-Saxon territories.
Perhaps these bowls were highly prized trophies of war, plundered from Celtic settlements to the north. What we do know is that they represent superb examples of ancient metalwork.
It was probably made somewhere in western and northern Britain, well outside the area of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And this we can tell not merely from the style of ornament, which might be misleading, but from the way the bowls themselves have been made. And for this, one needs to look at the metal itself. They're not cast, they've been made in a very fine way by beating up sheet metal and then finishing the whole bowl off on a lathe, so you get a very thin and lightweight bowl. And this is not particularly practical for everyday life. It's something which is a luxurious product for the most affluent in society, for patrons who could afford to deck their table with something rather special.
Back in the conservation studio, Hayley has discovered another precious attachment on the warrior's shield. A mysterious white substance on the back of this may support a theory about the appearance of Anglo-Saxon shields.
Now, as far as we know, there's no archaeological evidence to prove that Anglo-Saxon shields were painted. This is what we were thinking when we first saw this white layer, that perhaps it was paint, which was terribly exciting because it had never been found before. So again, this was sent for analysis.
Dave Thickett works in the museum's scientific research department. By analysing a small sample of the white material, he may provide answers about what substance lay on the surface of the shield.
What we've done here is infrared spectroscopy. So what we're doing is we're passing infrared radiation through the sample. Some of that radiation is absorbed, and along the bottom here we have an energy scale. The absorption results in a series of peaks. This is where energy is being absorbed. And with each molecule, this pattern of peaks is unique and characteristic. So if we run our sample, the blue spectrum, we can then compare that against standards. If we get the same series of peaks, that means it's the same material. And in this instance, what we've shown is that the sample that we removed is a material called calcium carbonate, common chalk.
Intriguingly, this may one day help support the theory that Anglo-Saxon shields were indeed painted. The conservation process has now revealed much about the warrior buried at Sutton Hoo. We have discovered that he was a man of power and authority, living in a time of violence, ambition and turmoil, and perhaps a man who helped shape the emerging kingdom of the East Angles. Conservation of the bowl is nearly complete. Hayley's final job is to repair and reconstruct its fractured metal surface.
We've got to the point where the bowl is together and the joins are made. The joins in some areas are just a bit fragile and need a bit of extra support. So we've got to the stage today where really I'm just beginning to support those joins and give those joins some extra strength so that when the bowl is handled and moved, there's not going to be any movement of those joins and therefore any sort of accidents and the bowl coming to pieces again. So where I'm finding that I'm having problems, I've just begun to in-paint those areas. I'm not painting the object. I'm not putting any paint on the original surface of the object. I'm simply painting any fills or any nylon gossamer backed joints just so that it blends into the overall image of the bowl and doesn't really draw your eye to new conservation materials. When the object was in the soil block, all surrounded by soil, it looked so sturdy and hardy and great. Then when it's removed, you think the job's nearly done and you're nearly finished. And actually, it's at that point really when the work really begins. It's really difficult, it's really complicated to be able to clean that object, to put it back into the shape that it originally was. And it's taken many, many hours to do so, and lots of sort of patience and care. So to actually see it in the kind of final stages, in the end stage of its conservation, it's great. It's absolutely great. It's a relief that it's done. It's a relief that it's back together. And I think when the escutcheons are all attached to that bowl and it's on display, it's going to be great.
The finished bowl will be exhibited in the new National Trust Visitor Centre at Sutton Hoo, much to the delight of the archaeologist who discovered it.
It's very good, the fact that the bowl, having been excavated some 2 years ago, is coming back to almost the same spot. Having been excavated just to one side of the tree, almost underneath the exhibition hall, the fact it's actually going to be put on virtually where it was found. It's very special.
Do not knock it off.
Do not knock hanging bowl off.
Do not crush the bowl.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks nice. I am pleased with it. I think it looks really, really good. And it's really nice to know that other people will be able to come along and appreciate it as well after all those hours of long slog and work. To see it finally up, complete together and set into a context as well is even better. It's really good.
Without the skill and dedication of conservators, it would be impossible to appreciate the beauty of these magnificent treasures. Their revelations are helping to define a period of early English history by providing new information and insights. After the discovery of the ship burial in 1939, archaeologists had to rewrite the history of the Dark Ages. Now, with the discovery of more graves in 2000, our understanding of the 6th century is being extended still further. We may never know for certain the rituals that accompanied the warrior's burial or the cremation of the woman in the metal bowl, but the epic tale of Beowulf, written some 2 centuries later, provides a chilling account of these pagan funerals. On a height, they kindled the hugest of all funeral fires. Fumes of wood smoke billowed darkly up. The blaze roared and drowned out their weeping. Wind died down and flames wrought havoc in the hot bone house, burning it to the core. Heaven swallowed the smoke.